We have learned from the previous videos that linguistics studies human language. But what is human language? How does it differ from non-human languages? To answer these questions, we need to understand the key design features of human language, which you can also call the definitions of human language. And they're the main topic of this video. However, instead of jumping right into the design features, which we could definitely do, I suggest we follow the footsteps of earlier linguists and discover for ourselves why identifying a set of key design features that all human languages share is not only a desirable move, but also an inevitable move in the study of language. When linguistics developed into an organized science in the 19th century, linguists did not immediately jump to offering a definition or a set of definitions for human language. Why? They were too occupied with individual languages, and especially their histories. So the main focus, or the trend in research back then, was historical linguistics, or diachronic linguistics. If you're a linguist working on English, you ask, where did English come from? What are its stages of development? And note that this is not just English linguists. If you are a Japanese linguist, or Finnish linguist, or Swahili linguist, or Navajo linguist, you essentially asked similar questions. Now, think about it. How would you go about gathering information needed to address questions of this kind? You couldn't rely on spoken language, because there was no record of spoken language back then. You would have to rely on records of written language. They found something very interesting based on written language. By comparing how certain words were written, linguists were able to conclude that many languages were related. Some of you may have heard of Grimm's Law, which is a product during this era. By the way, this Grimm is a co-editor of the famous Grimm fairy tales. According to this law, sounds like b and d becomes a weaker sounds like p and t. And then they become even weaker sounds like f and th, which corresponds to the th spelling in English. Why do we say certain sounds are weaker? Well, we'll have to talk about them when we turn to phonetics and study sounds. But for now, let's just look at some examples described by this law. So, ancient Greek words like pot becomes foot in English, which is a change from p in pod to a f in foot. Latin words like tres becomes three in English, which is a change from ta as in tres to th as in three. By comparing the spelling of words across languages, linguists then realized that languages have family histories much like ours. We can find the mother or the grandmother of a language by looking at how words are spelled in these languages. This kind of language kinship is often represented using a language tree like the one we have here. It's commonly believed that the many languages spoken from Western Europe to India share a common ancestor. The name of this common ancestor is Indo-European. Indo-European then split into Indo-Iranian and European. On the European side, it gave rise to Romance, Germanic, together with many other language families. English and German are well-known languages in the Germanic family. Languages like Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese are well-known languages in the Romance family. On the Indo-Iranian side, it further gave rise to languages like Persian, Bengali, and Hindi, as well as many other related languages between the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent. You can see the geographical distribution of these languages on this map. English is given to you as a reference point. It's surrounded by Celtic languages. If we move eastward, then we'll get into the Germanic family, a few Balkan languages, and then the Balto-Slavic family. Crossing the Bosporus Strait, we enter the Middle East, and this is where the Indo-Iranian family takes over. Historical linguistics was a major branch in the field of linguistics, but emphasis has since shifted to the description of languages at particular points in time. This more recent emphasis is also known as synchronic linguistics. Note that this does not mean that one cannot study a dead language like Latin or Old English from a synchronic perspective. As long as linguists have access to rich and quality language data, they can still provide a synchronic description or analysis of a dead language. After spending some time addressing questions about the histories of particular languages, linguists found them in an interesting loop. Surely, many languages go back to Indo-European or even an even older language called Proto-Indo-European. But what about before that? What does Proto-Indo-European go back to? If we can identify that language, we can always ask, what about going back further? At some point, linguists found it impossible to go further back because their pursuit is limited by the relatively short history of written languages. There is an upper bound to how far back we can go by comparing spellings across languages. Many got frustrated and gave up, but some realized that there was a tremendously important conclusion waiting for them. Say, if all languages can trace back to some other earlier language, and if there is one or a few earlier ones, then there is still the question, where do they come from? There must be one or a few earliest languages, namely languages that do not have predecessors, that just happened to occur, possibly due to genetic mutation or some other factors that we don't know, that we don't fully understand at this point. And that is the origin of human language. Now, this is a much harder question because linguists have no written record whatsoever to resort to. Without written record, one can't even imagine what that original language looked like in terms of sounds or meaning. In some sense, this really hard question is also one that's more fundamental than questions about the origins of particular languages, for it likely is closely related to questions about our intelligence, our evolution, and perhaps even our origin. Given this really hard but fundamental question, how should we go about in addressing it? As we have emphasized before, there is zero written record that can help us. Quite surprisingly, linguists turned to contemporary languages to address this really hard question. And here is why they did this. All humans have at least one language. We all have the ability to readily learn the language used in our environment, in our speech community, when we are within a certain age range. We've never seen animals use human language or their own communication systems in comparable ways. So, by understanding what sets all contemporary human languages apart from non-human languages, we effectively can answer part of the origin question. The origin of language must be a point in time when humans developed a capacity that enabled these features that we can find in human languages today. This is one of the reasons why linguists started to really pay attention to the design features that sets human languages apart. The most widely known set of design features of human language is proposed by Hackett in the 1960s. There are quite a number of features on Hackett's list, so I encourage you to pause this video and spend some time going through the list. I would like to highlight 4 features here. The first one is displacement. We often say what we see in our proximity, but we can also say what we saw in the past or what we will see in the future, whether the things that we are talking about are proximate or distant in terms of their location. What this indicates is an ability to communicate at the present time and the present location about things temporally and locationally displaced. The second one is productivity or openness. It describes a feature of language we have a lot of experience with. Every time there's something new, we can readily find a way to talk about it. There was a new disease. Well, we readily came up with a name for it. In fact, we came up with more than one name and debated which one was better. But this is not just about words. We constantly produce new utterances, and people have no problem understanding them. For example, the utterance, "This is a new utterance that no one has said before in front of a camera." It's probably novel, but it doesn't take you much effort to understand it. What is the trick for being able to produce and understand new utterances? It seems that there is something about the ingredients, such as the sounds and the words, and the way that they combine. It seems that we all have a well-formulated recipe for combining these ingredients over and over again to create a new message. This leads me to the next key feature, duality of patterning. What this feature sets is that there are 2 separate layers of patterning in human language. In the first layer, we're dealing with meaningless units, namely sounds or sound units. We have recipe for combining meaningless sound units, known as phonemes, into larger meaningful units, such as words. In the second layer, we can deal with meaningful units. We have another recipe for combining meaningful units, such as words, to form even bigger meaningful units, such as sentences. The last feature I would like to highlight is traditional or cultural transmission. Although we often emphasize that language is species-specific and implicit, language is not all in genetics, unfortunately. Unfortunately, we can't genetically inherit a language without being embedded in a speech community. Let me spell out how some of these design features distinguish human language from non-human communication systems. Back to duality of patterning. The word spot consists of 4 sounds. Now, none of these sounds is meaningful when it occurs alone. However, together, they can form something meaningful. The meaning does not come just from the sounds, but also how these sounds combine. Observe that the same 4 sounds can be used to form different words depending on how you combine them. In addition to spot, we can also form pots, stop, and tops, as well as ops. All the meanings of these words are arbitrary to a certain extent, but we agree about them as a community. Given duality of patterning, we can construct a large lexicon with many vocabularies. Animals seem to have pieces of language, but not quite the whole package. You perhaps have heard of Rico, the border collie, who was trained to recognize 200 distinct words. Rico was studied by scientists at the Max Planck Evolution Anthropology Lab in Leipzig. This article reports another border collie whose name is Chaser. Chaser have learned 1,000 words, according to the researcher who trained him. Now, border collies seem to be able to develop an impressive vocabulary. However, they typically only succeed after intensive reward-based training, which is not necessary for humans. We've said that productivity allows us to readily coin new words using existing pieces. Here I'm using Zoom as an example. In case you have been living away from human civilization in the past months, Zoom is a teleconferencing software many humans nowadays rely on to safely communicate with other humans because of the pandemic. If I ask you, are you Zoomable? You know exactly what I mean. If you reply, I'm Zoomless, I also know exactly what you mean. I will ask you to install Zoom following the Zoom instructions on Canvas. If you become a Zoom user, you can now call yourself a Zoomer or a Zoombie. This is how productive our language is. To a certain extent, researchers think that at least some of our primate relatives also have the ability to combine existing pieces to form new meaning. In this article, researchers report that the putty-nosed monkey is capable of combining two types of independently meaningful calls to form a third type of meaningful call. Crucially, the third type of call has a meaning or function that's different from the two calls it comprises. This is very encouraging. However, research on the productivity of animal communication system is still at its early stage. At this point, we have only ever seen very crude cases of productivity, and definitely not at the level comparable to human languages.